All right, everyone, if we could get started, please take your seats. We're ready with the final capstone speaker of the day, who I know will be really quite entertaining and interesting. It's going to bring a lot of closure to a lot of the concepts that we're talking about today. All right. Thank you all for your attention. I have the really great honor of introducing our next speaker, Jonathan Chambers, who is the Chief of the Office of Strategic Plans and Policy at the Federal Communications Commission. I've known John for several years. We worked together on Capitol Hill when John was Chief of Staff to Senator Jack Danforth, and we worked together on a lot of the legislation at that time and helped to put together what ultimately became the 1996 Telecommunications Act. John spent several years, 6 years, working for Sprint, so he spent a good deal of time in this neighborhood, in this community, and he's been at the FCC for the last couple of years now, really being one of the most thoughtful and one of the best leaders at the FCC in designing and implementing the program for the rural broadband experiments, for the E-rate program changes that we talked about earlier today, and he's really quite, I said thoughtful, but I want to emphasize that and go further, because a lot of the ideas that were contained in the E-rate program to encourage greater investment in new networks and broadband facilities, particularly in rural areas, are due to the insights and wisdom and the strong leadership of our guest speaker today. And I will say that when he first walked into the room this morning, when he arrived at the conference, he said, gosh, this feels just like coming home. Because he said 20 years ago, he came and led a meeting of Sprint and other broadband providers right in this very same ballroom in which we're speaking today. So he has a real strong connection to Kansas. He has a real strong affinity and support for the E-rate program and for broadband all across the country. So it's my great pleasure to invite to the podium Jonathan Chambers.
John said this wouldn't work if I put it here. We'll try. John also said a moment ago that I'd be entertaining. You know, there's always a bit of a tension when you work for the government about whether, when you're speaking in front of a group where there's press and others, whether you want to be entertaining or not, because you either say something interesting and get in trouble, or you say something dull and stay safe. It is really good. I did say when I came in this morning, it's like coming home. I've been back and forth to Kansas City for most of my professional career. As John mentioned, I worked for Jack Danforth, a senator from Missouri, and I worked for him for 8 years. And I used to come to Kansas City regularly. Then I worked for a joint venture of Sprint, TCI, Cox, Comcast. And I did that for 6 years and would come to Kansas City regularly. Our headquarters was here in Kansas City. And then I founded an MVNO, and Sprint was our underlying carrier. So for several years, I would come and talk to Sprint. So this, it really is a pleasure for me to be here with you all, and thank you for inviting me. I am not, just as a disclaimer, I am not going to talk about net neutrality. There's probably very little I could say that wouldn't get me in trouble. And it's not really what I work on. I'm mostly going to talk about money. Because that is what I work on at the FCC. I work on the programs that the FCC administers, which spend the public's money on telecommunication services, broadband services, principally 4 different programs. There's a school and libraries program that's known as E-rate, which is now a $3.9 billion annual program. There's a high-cost rural program, which is now called the Connect America Fund, which is becoming a $4.5 billion annual program. We have a Lifeline program, which does not have a set amount, but is about a $1.6 billion program this past year. And there's a rural health care program, which is up to $400 million. So all together, it's about $10 million annually in spending. I've been here through most of the day. I'm sorry I missed this morning and visited many of the sessions, as many as I could attend. And so I'm going to reflect on some of the comments I heard today and some of what we're working on. And I'd be pleased, if there's still time, to answer your questions here or answer your questions afterwards at the reception. Because I don't really come to things like this just in order to talk. I'm happy to talk, I'll talk for a living, but I really do get a lot more out of hearing what people are doing, what people's experiences are, what's happening on the ground. And again, I don't just mean that as a throwaway line. I will relate stories that I hear back in Washington or elsewhere that I speak, and it's how I learn. So please approach me afterwards or approach me during the session. I'm more than pleased to listen. I did not sit in on the E-rate session earlier today because John told me not to. I hope those of you who did have a good sense of it. I just want to say a couple of things about E-rate. The FCC adopted 2 orders this past year, both of which people like to say something fundamentally changed the program. What it really did was it set the program on a path to ensure that broadband access would be available to all schools and libraries in our country that wish to have broadband access. We've increased the amount of money available, as I said, to $3.9 billion. We've ensured for the first time, really, that there will be sufficient money for internal connections. Very few schools and libraries have been able to get funding from our program for internal connections for Wi-Fi up until what will be this coming funding year. We changed some of the rules around construction to make it easier to construct, particularly in rural areas. We set as a target for broadband speeds that we expect that all schools and libraries should have access, or schools should have access to 1 gigabit per second connections for every 1,000 students, which really means fiber to every school that desires it. And the same with libraries. And as I just said, we have taken steps to make sure that the rules we adopted, we sort of threw everything in we could think of. I said to John earlier, I have a pretty fertile mind. I couldn't think of anything else to do by the time we were ready to adopt the second order. We put in everything we could think of to try to get construction, particularly to rural schools and libraries. So we said, for example, that we would increase our share of the payment up to 10% more if a state would come up with funding to match for construction. We said in the case where a district or a school could not afford its construction cost in the first year, we would allow for the funding for that to be paid out over 4 years. We've equalized the treatment of dark and lit fiber. We've waived for the next several years a cap we had on amortization, which had been capped at $500,000, so we could ensure that larger projects could be funded. We've done all of this for one reason, which is we believe that over the next 3, 4, 5 years, 7 years, the nation should be engaged in this great project of building out fiber, high-speed, high-capacity internet access to every school and every library in the country. We think the funding that we're providing is sufficient. Yeah, we did our best to model out the needed funding, I used to do business modeling for a living. I don't think we're wrong on this one. I think we got our numbers right. Now, for your part, if you're in state government or work for a school district or a school or a library, or I don't know, Joe Butler's here, the state librarian, there are some things that you ought to be start getting ready to do to take advantage of this. And the E-rate program, by the way, is a complete bottoms-up program. We don't fund anything that a school or a library doesn't ask to be funded. We don't fund anything, we don't tell you what to do. We've set targets. We've set goals. We've made funding available. We set out what services we will fund, and we've made this a broadband program. But the funding requests, the RFP, the construction, all of that comes from the local level. It doesn't come, we don't plan out networks. So the couple of things that you all, if you're in that line of business, should be prepared to do in the next couple of years are, in this first year, as I said, we're making internal connection funding available, Wi-Fi funding available. And it really has only been available to about 1% of the libraries in the past few years, and maybe 10% or so of the schools. So this is a big change. So this year, the funding window, that is the application window, opens shortly and runs through to the end of March. This is really the opportunity to begin to get funding for internal connections. We have tried to make it clear that the funding will be available for years to come, so that there isn't some rushed planning and some rush for the money. We don't want people to do a sloppy job just because the funding's available for the first time. The funding will be available this year, it'll be available next year, it'll be available the year after that. But folks should start planning. And if they've already done their planning, they should start applying so that they can build. John mentioned to me in the earlier session on E-rate that a question came up about, particularly for internal connection construction, that it's best to do that during the summertime for schools, which makes all the sense in the world. And we begin to give out commitment letters, that is, that the funding is available for a particular application, as quickly as we can. But mind, we get applications from nearly all of the hundreds, 20, 30,000 school buildings and the 15 to 20,000 library buildings. So the application window ends at the end of March. To get commitment letters out before the summer construction period begins is tight. We accelerated our process last year. We're going to try to accelerate the process this year. I will take back to my colleagues at the FCC whether we might look at the internal connection commitment letters in a special way with the idea that summer is the time to build indoors for schools. One more thing about E-rate. Anybody at the FCC knows, because they heard me tell this story or use this example over and over again. Not quite a year ago, about 8, 9 months ago, I heard somebody sent me a link to a radio show. It was a local NPR radio show from Washington State. And there was an interview with the principal of a school in a little town on the Canadian border in the northeastern part of the state, a town called Curlew, Washington. School of a couple of hundred kids. They had a couple of T1s, 3 T1s in the school, which means their connection was about 4.5 megabit per second for a couple of hundred kids. And the principal was talking about the difference it made to his school kids not to have broadband. And so I called the guy up, and I talked to him, and I talked to the people in the state of Washington, and they were already planning, and they had an RFP out. And over the course of several months, this school was able to get, by the beginning of the school year, so a few months ago, was able to get a microwave link and 100 megabit per second connection to the school. So I spoke with the principal again, and asked him whether it had made a difference, even in the first few weeks, a month or so of school. And he told me this one couple of examples. He said, the very first day, we didn't have the connection the very first day of school, but we had to go through state testing. So we started our state testing, but we could only test 20 kids at a time. This was online testing that the state of Washington required. We could only test 20 kids at a time, and everybody else had to stay off the internet. He said, but by the second day of testing, we had our 100 megabit connection up, and we were able to test everybody at the same time. Everybody could use the internet. It caused no, and he said now, when I walk around the corridors of the school, I see how teachers are starting to use broadband connection. I see how they're introducing that into their classroom. I see how kids are starting to use it. He said, I can see the difference. He said, for my own sake, he said, I attended a conference last week in Spokane by video conference. Normally it would have been a 6-hour drive, and I was able to attend it from my school. He said, yeah, it's making a difference. Now I'm gratified for what he was able to do, what the people in the state of Washington were able to do. It came with E-rate funding. E-rate funded 80% of their connection. There's only one little niggling thing in the back of my mind, it has been all along. For the rest of the town, Curlew, Washington, according to the principal, they have dial-up. So the kids that go home, they won't be doing much homework online. The town, the businesses don't have that. And yet, we'll fund through E-rate a connection to the school. In fact, under the new construction rules that I was describing, let's say it's $1 million project to get to the Curlew School. If the state of Washington were to fund 10%, we would fund 90%, Curlew is an 80% discount school, we would fund 90% of the cost of building fiber to this school, and the state of Washington would pick up the other 10%, and all the school district would be paying, all that school would be paying, would be its monthly recurring charge, and it would get a fiber connection. And maybe if they have a fiber connection, somebody would think to build upon that fiber connection and get to other places in the town, get to businesses, and would do the kinds of things that I heard all day today, and consistently hear from people who live in rural America and don't have access to the internet. What a difference it makes. Which leads me to the second funding program that I mentioned, the Connect America Fund, which is a broadband program. Earlier, last month, the FCC announced that it was adopting a new broadband standard for Connect America funding, which would be, which is now to be a 10 megabit per second down, 1 meg up standard. That is to say, if you're in an area where there is a recipient of Connect America funds, that provider is to offer a minimum of 10-1 speeds. The FCC has further said that it would adopt, so we're proposing in our annual, I don't even know it's annual, it's a report on the state of broadband, that is what is being proposed by the chairman of the FCC is that broadband be defined as 25 meg, 25 down, 3 up. I guess in effect what we're saying is we think the nation can do better than the 4-1 that had been adopted several years ago. And I think that's a good thing. I think we should aim high. It was, when I was working in government in the 90s, there was a fellow named Michael Gerson who worked in the Bush administration. He had this phrase, nice phrase. He talked about the soft bigotry of low expectations. I find that true with rural America a lot of times. That people expect less, they get less. What we are trying to suggest by increasing the standards, by increasing the funding we're making available, is we think people should expect more. Now look, I know the old joke. I got the old joke. You know, what are the 10 most feared words in the English language? I'm from the federal government. I'm here to help. But what we're trying to do is we are trying to offer a hand. We're trying to set goals. We're trying to set standards. We're trying to make funding available where we can. But you know, we don't build anything at the FCC. We're not in the network construction business. We're in the network business. We have a deep and abiding interest in how networks are built and maintained and operated in the United States. But we don't build ourselves. We don't operate ourselves. We don't maintain them ourselves. And in large part, you know, neither do local communities. I'm sure you've heard, as I have over and over, there are examples where local communities have built broadband networks. My own view, where a local community wants to do it, they should be free to do it. But it's, you know, it's a tough business. I've been in the network business. I've been in the network business here and in Europe. You have to be willing. And I don't know what city manager wants to get the call, you know, in the middle of the night that, you know, a truck ran into a phone pole and knocked down a wire and somebody's got to get out there and repair it. It helps if the operators are part of this process of building out and maintaining and operating broadband networks. So that gets me to an issue that has been something I spent a lot of my time on in the past year, that got labeled the rural broadband experiment. And since it was my idea, let me just describe to you what I had in mind. The FCC decided several years ago that the funding that we provide for broadband networks in the country would, at some point, no longer just go to the incumbent telephone companies. That had been the case for decades, been the case for longer than that. Indirect subsidies, moving towards direct subsidies, and the FCC decided it would open up the funding to competitive bidding. But the FCC didn't say how it was going to do that. And it's difficult. So I had this notion a long time ago, I don't know, 20 years ago, which I finally acted on about a year ago, that we would try to take the funding that the FCC makes available and open it up to any community, to any provider, to any entity that wished to provide broadband to its community. And we labeled this an experiment because we wanted to see who would participate. We wanted to see what the funding requests were. We wanted to see, for example, whether rural telephone companies would cross into other territories, not just to serve a school or a business, but build out to residential areas. We wanted to see if the cellular providers would increase their speeds and capacity, same with satellite providers. We wanted to see if the electric companies, the electric co-ops, would build out with funding that we provided. We wanted to see what would happen. So we put a little bit of money up. Not a lot, $100 million. And I'm not so jaded. I've been in Washington for over 30 years, but you know, $100 million is a lot of money, except it's not a lot of money when you're talking about the whole country and building out broadband networks. So we put up a little bit of money. We didn't put restrictions on the technology, we just said you had to meet certain speeds. And we held an auction. We held that auction in October, so a few months ago. The auction idea being you would bid to serve an area, and we would provide funding to the low bidders. We're not done with the process yet because we're now reviewing financial and technical information. But the results so far is we got bids from cable providers, from electric co-ops, from telephone companies, from satellite. We got bids from communities. There was a lot of interest shown. And look, I know the process wasn't perfect. I know the software that we had to use for the bidding was a little kludgy. I know the letters of credit are difficult to get for small companies. I know the geographic territories don't always match up with the service territories people look at. I know that funding isn't always available in areas where you think it should be available. Because the way we fund is based right now is based on a model. A model that says what's a higher cost area compared to a lower cost area. And the funding we make available is based on a model. And we don't make funding available if there is an unsubsidized competitor in the area like a cable company. So it becomes something of a patchwork at times. We're trying to sort through all of these issues because, as I mentioned, over the next 10 years, we'll make $100 billion available, largely to rural areas. And it'd be nice to spend that money, not just spend it well, spend it right, spend it in a way in which the communities get what communities need. We spend the money efficiently. So the rural broadband experiment was meant to try to learn how best to allocate some of this money. We're not done with it yet. We will set rules for a much larger auction. We'll set rules later this year, probably late spring. I invite anybody who's either participated or has ideas about it to talk to us. The auction that we will hold, the next one will be in 2016. Most likely, it'll be more like a $3 or $5 or $7 billion auction, and it'll be for all of those areas of the country where a price cap carrier has elected not to serve the area. So it's important. I mean, it's important because unless others step up to take the funding and build out broadband networks, we're talking about areas where there's no alternative. I mentioned one other thing quickly, and then I see my time has run. The FCC over the last few years has modified its various programs, funding programs, from voice services to fund internet access services, broadband services. It's done so with E-rate, it's done so with high cost fund, and there's discussion now about what to do with the Lifeline program. The Lifeline program is designed to make telecommunication services affordable to low-income families. About 1 in 8 families get a subsidy through the federal Lifeline program, and there's state Lifeline programs as well. But it's a voice program largely. So we're discussing how to turn that into a broadband program. And I think in particular, and I think this is the area of greatest agreement, what we've done on E-rate is make sure that schools can get access to funding and get broadband, but not school kids. Not school kids after they leave school. Not school kids after they leave school and leave the library and have to do homework at home, particularly where the kid's from a low-income family. So I know there have been efforts to address this. Comcast runs a program to provide affordable internet access under certain conditions. I know there are libraries that have looked into trying to address this. The New York Public Library is running a program of about 10,000 where they're going to offer up to 10,000 devices, hotspot devices, MiFi devices for kids to take home and use at their home. Last year at some point when I was talking to the president of the New York Public Library and he was describing what they wanted to do, I said, you know, you should try to make that a national program, but to make it a national program, you're going to have to find partners elsewhere. You can't just run it in New York. I said, you ought to talk to Joe Butler in Kansas. As I last heard, Kansas is looking at the same kind of a program. There's not one solution for this, but it's something that we ought to do. I'll close just by saying, you know, I don't build anything. My hands are clean, no dirt under my fingernails, no calluses on my hands. But I did spend a lot of years working in finance and legal, regulatory, business planning for businesses that did build networks, wireless networks, internet access networks, cable networks, here and in Europe. It's something that I really liked doing. It's something that really has an impact on people's lives. And I used to say when we were building wireless networks, and I'd talk to state regulators, or I would talk at zoning meetings, rarely, but I'd say, look, the wireless tower that we're asking for here, you may see it as blight, but I see it as a connection. I see it as a father calling his son, somebody reaching out, somebody learning something. I really believe in networks, and I know all of you are here because you do too. I'll mention this as something that's on my mind because my oldest boy is going to be a bar mitzvah in a couple of weeks. So there's parts of the Bible that are on my mind. Ecclesiastes teaches us that everything has a season and there is a time for all activities under heaven. I think the next few years, 3 years, 5 years, is a time to build out broadband networks to schools, to libraries, to rural communities, to every place that we can build out networks. I look out amongst you, the turnout here is great. When John asked me if I would come, I said I'll always come to Kansas. But I didn't appreciate how many people would be here for something like this. So I'm probably standing between you all and cocktail hour. Thank you very much for listening to me.
So John has agreed to answer a couple of questions if there's a question from the audience. Yes, right ahead.
Yes, Jonathan, you mentioned the Health Connect fund, but you didn't elaborate on that. Could you give us your thoughts on that one as well?
Yeah, I don't know as much about it because I've never worked on it. I've worked on the other programs. I know it's the H in Shelby, so maybe I should educate myself. I realize that it's $400 million and it's undersubscribed. So either, there's not the need, or there's something that should be addressed in the program to make sure that those who need the funding can get access to it. What I was saying to John earlier was, we tried a lot of things in E-rate to make sure that funding would go to areas. We heard a lot over the course of the past couple of years, about how in certain parts of the country, it's not just the funding availability, it's the rules around it. So what I said to John was, I think we ought to look at what we just did at E-rate, and maybe there are things we can learn from E-rate if the construction pieces work, and put them into the Healthcare Connect piece. We did that in a way, we took some of what we learned from Healthcare Connect and put it into E-rate, so it's just right that we might, if there are things that are working in E-rate and there are shortcomings in the healthcare program, that we would do that. I'm just not smart enough to know right now what those are, but I'll get smarter.
Question? Yeah, hopefully a quick one. You mentioned in your remarks about Lifeline and the FCC looking to change the rules so that it would not just be voice. And I know that subject comes up here in Kansas. Could you just maybe, for those who may not be familiar, why that is what's hard about that? Because it seems like a no-brainer, just conceptually. Well, of course, voice is internet. Can you speak to what the challenges are and why that's a big process to make that happen?
So there are some people who would argue that the definitions in the Communications Act says that the funding, universal service funding goes for telecommunication service, which is a voice service. Now, what we said for a different issue for E-rate, because that part of the act doesn't apply. What we did in high-cost areas, we said the funding goes to networks, and the networks carry both voice and data. We would have to come up with a rationale for making broadband available. You could probably do it by making sure that it was broadband and voice. The reason I became a lawyer was so I could argue with lawyers who didn't agree with me. Maybe we just need to come up with a better way of looking at it, because and I say that not really flippantly. If your main communication is a mobile device these days, so the mobile operators today run a voice network and a data network, but it's all moving to one network. It's all moving to a data network. Once there's voice over LTE, it'll all just be data. Voice probably won't be, voice will be a component of your data package. You'll just be subscribing to data networks. So we ought to be able to anticipate that networks are all moving to data, so we ought to be funding that which is used by people. Will be the last people paying for voice through our program otherwise. So there's support for making broadband available. Yeah, I gotta talk to the general counsel's office about how it's done.
Also, there's money, right? Broadband is more expensive than POTS.
You'd be surprised. Not necessarily not. It isn't, it's been mentioned for something like Lifeline, and it's not, look, people who don't adopt broadband today, there are some people who don't because it's expensive, but the surveys that NTIA has shown, all the surveys say most people, 2/3 of the people who don't adopt broadband today don't adopt it because it's not important to them. It's not meaningful to them. Which is why I think we start with school kids, something like the Lifeline program. Because once families see that it's important to their kids in school, it becomes meaningful to the family. I think that's the right approach. That's where I'd start, at least that's where I recommend we start.
Good deal. Thank you again, Jonathan. That's unfortunately all the time we have for questions.